Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So in this video I want to try something a little different than my usual book discussions and give a kind of video essay a go. And this is a topic that has certainly been relevant to my life in the past year, maintaining creativity and productivity in a pandemic. So you may remember seeing this tweet about a year ago saying that Shakespeare wrote King Lear while he was quarantined because of the plague. Looking back, this tweet came out like hilariously early in the timeline of COVID. It was like the first week of lockdown. But anyways, this sparked a lot of different reactions online. I think some people took it the way that I think it was intended, which is inspiring about all the great things you're going to get done. Equally valid is that this is just a little intimidating and doesn't really help you at all. Not only do you have to be writing, but you have to be writing at an extremely high quality because you have all this extra time. And then there was also this counter response, which I first saw with this tweet, but I definitely saw pop up at many points throughout the past year, that just surviving in this time was good enough and your expectations for yourself should actually be way lower. You should not punish yourself for that. So on any given day over the past year, I've probably agreed with all of these things at one point or another. I mean, I've had my own spectrum of feeling encouraged and discouraged about my work, which I'm sure all writers are experiencing. But all of this musing on what I should be doing as a writer right now got me thinking about, well, what have other writers done in these circumstances? And if you look at that, what kind of theory of pandemic productivity is going to come out on top? And also, like, is that thing about King Lear even true? Well, the answer to that latter question was not the most satisfying. It was kind of a maybe, sort of. In the end, it sounds a lot less catchy with a little more context. The first issue is that, like, assigning a time when a certain Shakespeare play was written is not by any means cut and dry. Now, I've been doing some pretty amateur investigation, but it seems like there's harder evidence about when these plays were produced or published, but that's not really there for when Shakespeare was sitting down and writing them. It's all a little murky, so yeah, it's possible that King Lear was written in quarantine, but it seems also equally possible that it's not. The next wrinkle in all of this is the context of the plague itself, which I think renders the initial point a little irrelevant in trying to find a comparison to COVID. And it definitely makes the whole Shakespeare wrote King Lear in quarantine thing a lot less compelling. So the plague in London was not just 1 year of quarantine. It was a reality of Shakespeare's entire life. It was inescapable since his infancy. Shakespeare lost siblings, friends, his own son to plague, and it didn't just happen in 1 year. There were many, many major and minor outbreaks throughout his lifetime. Based on the loose timeline of when King Lear was put out into the world, I assume that we're referring to the 1603 outbreak and that quarantine. And that was a very, very devastating outbreak of the plague. Different reports that I found online had anywhere from a fifth to a quarter of London's population dying. And that was definitely a significant event, but it wasn't the first lockdown kind of situation, and it certainly wasn't the last. So when outbreaks of the plague started building up and hitting certain numbers, mass gatherings and theaters were the first things to go. I was surprised to learn that for a much larger period of time than we think, theaters weren't even open in Shakespeare's time. Things were very on and off. The theaters would open back up for a little while, they would close again. So we can definitely assume that the theater closures were affecting him financially. And I think, yeah, we can assume that they would affect him creatively too. If we're going to make assumptions about Shakespeare's personality, if he was primarily working in a theater environment, which is busy around a lot of people, maybe isolation wasn't his ideal. But again, the lockdowns were happening all the time. The theaters were being shut down all the time. So, I mean, he probably got used to it, you know, this was his reality. The plague was inextricably a part of his life. There was not much novel about it, I would imagine. It was always there, which is obviously very different from our current experience of this 1 year. And that's the thing about making it into a point that Shakespeare wrote King Lear in quarantine. He probably wrote a lot of his plays in quarantine. And he never wrote a word that wasn't at least under the influence of the plague existing and being a thing, even if there wasn't a major outbreak happening at that moment. So the whole thing feels a little less catchy when you think that he might also have written Macbeth and The Tempest and Measure for Measure during lockdown periods. I mean, I don't know any exact dates or anything, but there was a period of like 6 years where the theaters were closed as often as they were open. So statistically, yeah, he wrote some of those plays in quarantine. I also want to point out that while I'm sure that the actual experience of being Shakespeare and writing, there's daily change and ebb and flow, but if you look at the big picture of sort of how he put out every play and kind of the timeline of his work, he's pretty consistent. Or at least to my eye, I'm not seeing any gaps that you might think were because you weren't doing as much in isolation. And I'm also not really seeing any like upticks because, oh, you're in quarantine, so now you've got all this extra time to produce this work. Of course, Shakespeare's context for the plague is very, very different than what's happening in the world right now. But it seems interesting to me that everything evened out and kind of came out in the wash. As far as the quality of King Lear, I don't really want to attribute that to just like having the extra time to focus on it because of a quarantine. I prefer to think that that's just the culmination of his life's work. You know, King Lear was later down the road in his career. He had been honing his craft for a long time. So I like to think that no matter what had happened, he would have been writing at that caliber at that point in his life anyways. So long story short, I don't know if Shakespeare wrote King Lear in quarantine. It is certainly one of his more depressing plays, so that kind of checks out, but do we want to aspire to that? But yeah, just knowing a little bit more about the plague kind of exposes that it's not a good comparison to COVID and what we're dealing with right now. And also, like, it's just never good or healthy for us to be comparing ourselves to Shakespeare. I also looked a bit into Shakespeare's contemporaries, and, you know, I learned about an interesting trend around the 1603 outbreak of writers switching genres. Obviously, in the Elizabethan era, theater's pretty limited during a lockdown. You can't produce your plays, you can't make money, nobody's going to see that work. So it seems like some writers took a more direct approach in writing these pamphlets, like Thomas Dekker in his sarcastically named pamphlet, The Wonderful Year, which was written and published in 1603. Bear with me here, but I'm kind of equating that practice to writers of all genres today putting out newsletters on Substack. I had never even heard of Substack until 2020, but it seems like it's really blowing up a lot. A lot of the writers I follow online have started writing through that medium. It's a really direct and immediate way to write something and get eyes on it. So I definitely think quarantine can be a time when how we write and where we write shifts a little bit. Now, one other thing that I found promising about all of this was what came immediately after the 1603 outbreak. So in 1604, London bounced back surprisingly quickly, considering that huge amount of life that had been lost. Lots of people were moving to the city. There was a lot of immigration at the time. The population grew. The delayed coronation finally happened. And there was a big boom in arts and culture and literature. Yeah, there was a big comeback. There were more outbreaks and more lockdowns to come after that, but 1604 seemed to be a pretty good time for writers. So all of that was interesting to read about, but after doing all of that, I was hoping that I could find some better example somewhere else in a different pandemic, so that maybe there is a "this writer wrote this thing in quarantine" kind of statement that can be effective and satisfying for me. So now we're going to move up to 1918 and the Spanish flu. So there's a few reasons I thought this might be a little more useful to us. First off, obviously it happened a lot more recently, so we've got better information about when writers were writing things. And the whole timeline of Spanish flu feels more comparable to COVID. It's a shorter pandemic than the plague, obviously. And a lot of the things we're doing now, you've probably seen this pointed out online, are similar. Mass gatherings were being shut down, people were wearing masks, things like that. Of course, there is one big factor for writers in 1918 that we can't ignore, which is the First World War. So that is going to have a major effect on any conclusions we might be able to draw, so keep that in mind. So anyways, I wanted to look at specific writers of that time and kind of see how their pacing was, what they were writing then. When I'm talking about pacing, that means something different for every writer, just kind of based on the rest of their career and their timeline. Are there any major gaps where it seems like they weren't writing at all or anything like that? And honestly, when I'm looking at the bigger picture of that, I don't know if a more trained eye would see something different, but I'm not seeing a ton of variation or anything that stands out when you look at it on that scale. It doesn't really seem like these writers are being more productive with the supposed extra time, but it doesn't seem like they're being less productive either. I imagine it felt different to the writers while they were living it, and I think those writers who were living in 1918 can certainly understand kind of the modern feelings right now of like every day we're living through this huge world-stopping level history-making kind of stuff. But it doesn't really seem to be detrimental or super helpful either way to just like the numbers of their creative production. And this lack of major effect seems even more significant to me because so many of the writers I was reading about were actually infected with the Spanish flu and just kind of kept on. And maybe it's just me, but I find the no effect to feel better than any other result I could have gotten here. So D.H. Lawrence, Willa Cather, Edith Wharton, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, they all, to me, seem like they kept up the same pace through the Spanish flu. And again, a lot of writers had it. F. Scott Fitzgerald was infected while he was writing his first novel, This Side of Paradise. T.S. Eliot had it around the time that he was writing The Wasteland. Virginia Woolf seemed to be dealing with the Spanish flu for a long period of time, so it affected lots of her writing, I assume. And that alone feels plenty inspiring to me, even before we throw the fact that there was a world war going on at the same time. But I guess the Shakespeare thing feels a little more viral friendly. So once again, there's this major art, culture, literary boom that follows the Spanish flu, which of course gives me hope looking forward as we're kind of starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel now. And we all know about the Roaring Twenties and the Harlem Renaissance and this very lively, creative period in our history. But also I don't think we can attribute that entirely to the Spanish flu because we were also coming out of a world war. So that kind of throws a little wrench into that conclusion. But still, I mean, I've seen people online sort of making the Roaring Twenties kind of jokes, but I think there's good reason to believe something like that might happen. But personally, in all of my reading and research, what I found the most uplifting as a writer were a couple of the kind of specific anecdotal successes of writers at this time. So I mentioned Fitzgerald was writing his first novel when he was infected with the Spanish flu. You know, he was very young in his career at this point, but in 1920, when This Side of Paradise was published, he became a very big success very quickly. And then another one that I found interesting was Edith Wharton. So during the time period of the Spanish flu, she was writing A Son at the Front, but the first thing that she wrote after that period was Age of Innocence. So yeah, she kind of wrote her masterpiece in the time after. So maybe there isn't a super clear example of this writer wrote this thing in quarantine and you should be inspired by that. But I feel better with the thinking that maybe there are good things to come. A kind of sub-point that my research kept coming back to was how and if at all writers write about the epidemic that they're living in. Like, I think if you take the temperature online, you know, what I've seen on Twitter and things like that, when people are thinking about consuming media that is about COVID, the response is kind of an eye roll. I think with a few exceptions, it just feels too soon. Like, we're all inundated with it all the time. Like, what could you possibly say right now? There's a part of me that thinks maybe you need a little more perspective, the perspective of some time past, to be able to write well about this and not just feel like you're trying to take advantage of the moment or something. And this came up a lot with the Spanish flu, which is sometimes referred to as the forgotten pandemic. You know, people weren't really writing about it very much. And like backing back up to Shakespeare for a second, he didn't really write directly about the plague either. It came up in his imagery a lot. A lot of the language kind of reflected the language of plague. And it was like a plot device in the conclusion of Romeo and Juliet. But it's not like he wrote a play where, you know, the main conflict was the plague. So with the Spanish flu, the World War is often cited as being kind of a distracting topic, in that writers at that moment were writing about that, so they weren't putting their energy towards writing about the Spanish flu. But there are some writers who kind of circled back to it years later, which seems to me to be the best course of action, the one that makes the most sense. So Catherine Ann Porter wrote kind of the Spanish flu text in Pale Horse, Pale Rider, which was published like all the way in 1936. And I don't think it was much appreciated in its time, but you know, it's kind of considered an important text to read about the Spanish flu specifically now. A few years down the road, Virginia Woolf, who was personally very much affected by the Spanish flu, she wrote about the mental toll of it, which seems pretty ahead of its time for me. That was definitely very interesting. Anyways, I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of exceptions to this, and I can be proven wrong on this point, but I just don't think that everything has to be written about or written about right on the spot of it happening. And I'm going to be more interested to see in the years to come if writing about COVID and this time has sort of a place in literature a few years down the road, if it ever really catches on, or if we don't really write about it at all. And I don't know, just like 10 years from now, what are the insights going to be? So, what is it? What should we as writers be doing right now? Should we be writing the best works of our lives? Should we be ultra productive? Should we be kind of stagnating a little bit and being comfortable and okay with that? And honestly, I think the best answer is somewhere in the middle, as it often is. When you look at the span of these writers' careers over their entire lifetimes, you know, the effects on their productivity seem to be pretty minimal. And the actual experience of being a writer always feels like either you're not doing enough or you're burning yourself out. Like, I feel like that's just the constant reality of it, whether you're in a quarantine or not. So, I mean, it's not natural to think of your own life and your own career as like the big picture, your entire lifespan. But I think maybe looking back at these other writers might give some perspective that you can't really have looking at yourself. Basically, I have decided to not worry about it. I mean, I finished my thesis in quarantine. I've started a new project. I've also probably watched too much TV and spent too much time just sitting around. But looking back a year later, I can't really feel that bad about how I've spent this time creatively. Like, it's all gonna be okay. And remember, if you still feel bad that you're not writing King Lear right now, you know, maybe you're on the cusp of your this side of paradise or your age of innocence. You know, we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel of this, and I see no reason not to believe that history will repeat itself and better things are to come. At the very least, from an artistic, creative perspective, at least that aspect of our lives. So if you got this far into my rambling here, thank you for entertaining me trying something a little different. I really enjoyed all of the research and thinking that went into making this. Like, if my usual videos are me trying to replace the void of book reports, this is definitely filling the void of essay writing. So yeah, I might try something like this again soon. The next video will probably be about a book though. Okay, well, that's all I have. Thanks for watching. Bye.